thanking James, I guess, and well, maybe other people as well for inviting me to this conference. Let me first introduce myself a little bit, because I guess some of you don't know what IGC is, and there's a reason for this. IGC, so Intergovernmental Consultations on Migration, Asylum, and Refugees. It's an informal, non-decision-making forum for information exchange between like-minded countries, dealing with a broad range of issues relating to migration, asylum, integration, enforcement, return, and whatever, all related to migration. We have regular working group meetings focusing on specific themes. We organize thematic workshops, and we have senior official meetings as well. The 17 countries involved in IGC are listed there. I won't sum them up. And now the reason why most of you probably don't know IGC is just that it's limited to the state entities. So we're actually only dealing with the authorities. So normally NGOs, academics, etc. don't have access to IGC meetings nor to the IGC website, which is used to exchange all the information. We have some observers to all of our meetings, and that's IOM, UNHCR, European Commission, and sometimes other EU agencies. And sometimes we also involve external speakers. Now, why am I here? IGC has been dealing with exclusion issues in the far and recent past. It has been a recurrent topic at meetings of the Asylum and Refugees Working Group, which I am organizing. But that was mainly in the period 2003-2004. Joseph has been attending those meetings in the past. The IGC has an exclusion cases database, which was set up in 2005, but which is now more or less dormant. So we have exclusion cases selected by participating states, and we have this in a database with full text summaries and a search function. But since 2008, it hasn't really been used anymore. So now we're actually considering whether to revive the whole process or not. We also have, and you see a picture there, the Blue Book, which is a very extensive report on state practices. It's not only related to exclusion. Actually, exclusion is just a very, very small part of it, but it contains 17 country chapters with all the asylum procedures in general, and so you can also find some information on exclusion there. This report will be updated, normally in 2012. This is a version of 2009. It is available, it's publicly available, this one, and it's for free because we still have a lot of copies in our basement actually. So I left some flyers on the table back there. So if you want, you can just send an email, and then we will only charge you transport costs, and you can get the report for free. But what is most important for this conference is the workshop that we organized on exclusion policies on the 9th and 10th of June. This workshop was initiated by the Netherlands, was chaired by the Netherlands. We had 30 participants from 13 countries, as well as UNHCR. And the aim was to exchange information on policies, best practices, and challenges in the field of exclusion, and to identify ways forward. So for this presentation, I will mainly base myself on the outcomes of this workshop, as well as background information which we gathered before. So in this short presentation, I will focus on practices of government administrations responsible for RSD at the first instance. So I won't really talk about jurisprudence, because in Canada, the first instance is a tribunal like instance, but in most countries it's civil servants working within a special RSD department of the ministry or related to the ministry. I won't talk about jurisprudential issues, but more on practical and operational issues. So first, I intend to sketch the different exclusion contexts in different states and touch upon some of the most important factors that have an impact on exclusion practices. Then I'll run through some of the most common challenges faced by RSD administrations. And finally, I'll look at how states are moving forward on these issues. So let's first take a look at caseloads. I would like to show you a very nice table and beautiful graphs, but it's just impossible because there is no clear data on exclusion cases, at least not in most states. Actually, most states at our meeting could only present some estimations of the number of cases they had. And there are quite some differences there as well. So when looking at the last 5 years, for instance, the largest number of exclusion decisions has been taken in the UK, Canada, United States, and France. Then Norway, Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Sweden, and Norway followed. They had between 10 and 25 cases a year. Then very low number of exclusion decisions were taken in Australia, Denmark, and Ireland. And actually New Zealand had only one case in the last 5 years with exclusion elements, but it didn't lead to an exclusion decision. And it's actually rather interesting to look at the let's call it success rates of exclusion investigations. So when we look at how many investigations actually lead to exclusion decisions, there's a huge difference between states. We only have data for some states, but for instance in Germany, they answered that 20 out of 30 investigations in the last year actually led to exclusion, which is a lot. If you compare it with, for instance, Ireland, where since 2008, 133 investigations were undertaken, and only 7 actually resulted in exclusion. So there's a difference in capacity probably, in know-how, and even in interpretations. And the most cited nationalities are probably, as can be expected, Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkey, Sri Lanka, Rwanda, and ex-Yugoslavia. Then there are big differences between organizational structures as well. So you have some countries which have specific 1F units within their RSD administration dealing with the exclusion cases themselves. Then you have some countries, like for instance Australia, Canada, UK, which have a war crimes team or section or unit, which is not necessarily only limited to the RSD procedure, but it's more interdepartmental. And then there's, for instance, Sweden, which has a special case. They don't have a 1F unit, but there is a working group on exclusion cases involving not only the Swedish migration boards and police and prosecutor's office, which would be more or less normal, but also UNHCR and even NGOs, which is quite special in the state context. Most states, however, do not have a central coordination point on 1F issues, and only have a number of caseworkers who have received some form of specific training. Then on the exchange of information, there are big differences as well on the level of exchange of information, whether it is between departments or with police and judicial authorities or even with other states. There's the question of practical organization, of course, but also confidentiality issues. Some states automatically inform police and judicial authorities when elements of crime are detected in a case. Others only refer important cases, and some only inform judicial authorities when actually a decision has been taken. Information provision from the police and intelligence services to migration and asylum services is often very problematic. So most asylum administrations just don't receive any information, even if it would be useful. Information exchange at the international level on exclusion cases is very limited. And on information exchange with UNHCR, there as well, within the asylum track, there's very little information that is being exchanged, only on a case-by-case basis, and well, for resettlement, this is different, as already mentioned by Jennifer. There's more information being exchanged there. With regard to time and resources, the level of time and resources that can be spent on examination of exclusion clauses largely influences the ability of the RSD administration to detect and examine exclusion cases. So that's also a reason why in some countries, for instance, there are not many cases. That maybe it's just because they're not looking for them. Then on procedures and practices, there are quite some differences in the practical implementation of exclusion procedures and variations within the legal framework. A recurrent discussion, for instance, is whether exclusion should be applied before exclusion or vice versa. There, most states, at our workshop at least, follow UNHCR guidance and only consider exclusion after having determined that there is a well-founded fear for persecution. But the Netherlands is an exception, so I won't go into detail. Maybe Africa can tell something more about that. A number of states only have an exclusion check within the asylum procedure, and for other migration procedures, then there is often no such check available, which is problematic, of course, because a lot of potential exclusion cases come in through another procedure. Other states have general exclusion or exclusion-like checks for all migration procedures, and there are, as mentioned already before, there are some countries using exclusion as or exclusion-like grounds as inadmissibility grounds, such as Canada and the US. For the US, I can just mention that US asylum authorities are actually finding it very challenging as well that this inadmissibility rule is there, because sometimes they are confronted with cases that they would like to resettle and they just cannot do it. But I can come back to that later. There are important differences as well with regard to the consequences of return, be it return or stay. The consequences of exclusion, sorry, be it stay or return. So it was also mentioned before, some states actively stimulate excluded persons to leave the territory voluntarily. So AVR is always an option, but some states actually try to convince them to do it. Exclusion or forced return is possible in many states. Of course, only if there's no risk for refoulement. On the other hand, there are some states, like France, Germany, New Zealand, and Norway, that have not forcibly returned any excluded people. Not because they don't do it out of principle, but they just don't consider it to be a real possibility. Some states have tried to remove excluded persons to a third country, but this proves to be difficult. And some states like Sweden, US, UK have tried diplomatic assurances, but with very mixed results. Then when departure of the individual is not possible, the person will stay. And then the question is, what do we do here? Do we give them a temporary residence permit, which might give the impression that, you know, it's okay? But of course it's not okay. Some really restrict this. In the Netherlands, for instance, such a temporary residence permit is only possible after 10 years of a legal stay and in extreme humanitarian situations. Then there are states that don't issue any permit at all, but do allow them to work and study, like Canada and US. And then in some countries, excluded persons are just considered illegals, full stop. Whatever happens to them, that's their problem. Okay. Yeah, and then with regard to the difference between asylum and resettlement, it was mentioned already before. In resettlement states, or in resettlement procedures, there's no formal decision. So states can decide on resettlement without actually having to motivate why they're refusing a case. So that's quite problematic, of course, because in some cases UNHCR apparently is not aware. Is not aware that there are exclusion grounds, so they will just re-refer a case to another state, unknowingly, of course. Okay, let's now go very quickly to the challenges and the needs. First of all, there's in most states a very clear lack of comprehensive approach. So information on exclusion cases is not exchanged effectively. So the one hand actually doesn't know what the other hand is doing. And this allows, of course, potential war criminals to enter the country without anyone knowing. Again, Afka will tell us more about this comprehensive approach, so I won't go into detail. I will skip the rest of this slide. I just want to mention the lack of investigative power and resources. That's a big problem, of course, because exclusion cases are very time-consuming, resource-intensive. And so if the RSD administration doesn't have the time to invest, they will probably focus on other things and try to decide the case another way. Just go look for other grounds to decide. Because in most cases there are different possibilities. There are always credibility issues, etc. But the problem, of course, is if you decide to make a negative decision, even if there's actually potential for exclusion, then this exclusion case will go off the radar and no one will know about it. He can go into appeal or try another procedure and still manage to enter the territory. There's a lack of legal specialization. That's another important challenge. And of course, especially states that don't have a specific 1F units have problems interpreting the legal context. There are a lot of divergent interpretations at different levels, so between case workers in the same unit or between units, between regions. In Belgium, for instance, there's a different way of looking at things by the Dutch-speaking side and the French-speaking side, etc. Other challenges, I'll go very quickly. Determining the individual responsibility, getting evidence, the burden of proof, confidentiality rules. There's a lack of country of origin information. Often information on war crimes only emerges after a very long time. So it's also important to review cases from time to time. Credibility is a big issue in all RSD procedures, but especially actually in exclusion cases. Because an applicant may try to minimize or cover up his personal liability, but there are also cases where actually people are falsely claiming to be involved in war crimes just because they know that this will probably make it impossible for the state to return them. So it goes both ways. Another maybe last challenge is, I didn't mention it here, but public opinion. This is very important for states. If you have a court deciding that a convicted terrorist will still get a refugee status, how do you explain that to the big audience? Now, so far for challenges, let's just very quickly go to the way forward. UNHCR guidelines are being updated. We talked about this, so I won't go into detail. I can just repeat what Dominic said before. Participating states really want to be involved and would like to see a more operational version of the guidelines. So they would be very happy also to be involved in consultations, external consultations, once there's a draft available. There are more and more states trying to get some form of comprehensive approach, so reaching beyond the individual asylum administrations, trying to foster links with other departments, etc. There are more and more specialist units emerging, which is a good case. Then training, just to mention, training is very, very important, of course, both at the basic level and the advanced level. Something to mention here is the EAC exclusion module. That's a uniform training module in the European Union, which consists of e-learning sessions and face-to-face training. So the aim is actually to harmonize, or to actually give the same training to all caseworkers in all European member states. So this is hopefully helping to harmonize policies. Other ways to find this harmonization within the EU context that can be mentioned are of course the fact that EU member states are bound by provisions regarding exclusions in the qualification and procedures directives, and something quite new is actually the impact that the European Court of Justice is having. So European Court of Justice is also starting to interpret the provisions on exclusion that are actually to be found in the qualification directive. So there's a very recent case there, ECG Germany versus BND from November 2010, which is a very important case and deals, among other things, with the concept of membership, etc. And then finally, I've been taking more time than I should, and I apologize. There was at the workshop a very big need of information exchange and cooperation between RSD administrations in different states. Not just exchanging cases, which we did before, and apparently the need for this is not that big, but more practical issues, best practices, opinions, etc. So actually, we will now try to accommodate these needs at the IGC by using our website, by creating a contact list, by using an online discussion forum, etc. Of course, this will only be available for state administrations, but if something comes out of this, you will probably hear about this in a future version. So, I would thank you.
Thank you, Ward.